The Hastati, the most inexperienced of the heavy infantry, the second to enter combat in the Legion but the first to do so in hand-to-hand combat. Know their origin, their equipment, and their function here and now. The origin of the Hastati dates back to the reforms of Camillus, after the Roman defeat in 387 before Christ at the hands of the Gauls, and the unit was maintained until the reforms of Gaius Marius of the 107 before Christ, although it is true that they had variations. The term Hastati or asteros in Spanish comes from the word hasta, which is a spear used by the Romans. So we can deduce that in their beginnings these men were armed with spears, that is, they were lancers. And this is so because Camillus reformed the army without wanting to completely abandon the phalanxes, because they had been using them until then. That's why, even though another form of organization was introduced eliminating the phalanx as such, the spear was kept. However, at some point, between 387 and 315 before Christ, the Hastati abandoned their spears and become swordsmen. We will see it later with the weaponry. The Hastati were among the poor citizens of the Republic, although they were not the poorest, as this title was held by the Velites. If you don't know them, you can do so right now by clicking on the link shown at the top of the screen. Along with the Velites, they were the youngest and most inexperienced soldiers in the army. We could say that the Velites and Hastati had the same military experience, only some had more purchasing power than others. If you want to see how they were organized within the army, click on the link you will see at the top of the screen, where you will learn about the centuries, the maniples, the turme, and the entire command hierarchy of the consular army. Let's now start analyzing the military equipment of these men. Let's start first with the offensive weapons. As we have said at the beginning, they carried shafts, which were long spears used by the ancient Roman fringes, but they quickly switched to using swords. These swords were very similar to the kopis used by the Etruscans, which in turn was the one used by the Greeks. That sword we see on screen, which had a good cutting capacity, but knowing the way the Romans fought, they do not need cutting capacity, but piercing. That's why the legions, after seeing the swords used by the inhabitants of Hispania, changed their copies for the gladius, which we all know. Brutally effective for penetrating enemy protections and for combat, in the way the Romans did it, in tight formation and behind a wall of shields. Now we come to a weapon also very iconic of the Romans, the Pilum. Here I'm going to make a point about a mistake I've seen in the comments, quite repetitive. If it's singular, it's called a Pilum, while if it's plural, it's called pila, one Pilum, two pila. Okay, with this clear, let's proceed with the weapon. The Pilum was a heavy javelin that the legionnaires threw at the enemy during the charge, taking advantage of the speed the enemy was moving at. To increase the piercing capacity of these projectiles, obviously they could also throw them at a stationary enemy. Each legionnaire carried two pila. One engineering work that these pila had is that when they stuck into the enemy's shield, this part of the tip, which was weak, bent under the weight of the wood. What we have is that the tip has pierced, but the pilum has bent, rendering the shield useless. It also became very difficult to extract the projectile, so the enemy ended up throwing the shield on the ground. Regarding the shield, the Romans carried the scutum, which was an oval shield with curvature. This shield weighed between 7 and 10 kilos and covered from the shoulder to the knee. It was made up of 2 sheets of wood covered with canvas and calf skin, as Polybius describes. The edges are covered with iron, so that enemy cuts cannot split it in two. The shield. In addition, this iron protection prevented the shield from rotting when it was resting on the ground. By the way, are you subscribed? No? Well, come on, do it, subscribe and join the Hispanic Guard so you won't miss any video from the channel. We are waiting for you. Alright, let's continue, because we are now going with the protections. We have the most basic armor that the Romans used, the pectoralis, which is the one we see on screen. This consisted only of a metal plate at the height of the thorax, held to the body by leather straps. This plate was made of bronze or copper, and its function was to prevent an enemy thrust from piercing the legionnaire's heart or lungs. The rest of the torso was unprotected. If an Hastati had enough money, he could afford an iron chainmail, although it was not common among the Hastati. As I mentioned earlier, they didn't have much money. This chainmail is known as lorica hamada. Let's move on to the legs now. The Hastati used the ochra, which was a Greek origin greave made of metal because, again, the Hastati couldn't afford many expenses. They only had one, and they put it on the left leg. Why on the left leg? Because it was the leg that was most forward in combat. It was the closest to the enemy. Just like before, if a legionnaire had more money, he could buy a second greave for the right leg. For the feet, they didn't have protections, but they did have suitable footwear that could be used for long marches and at the same time be comfortable enough to fight in battle. This was called kaliga or kaliga. In plural, they are sandals like the ones shown on screen with nails in the sole, to allow the legionnaire to plant his foot on the ground and be able to exert more force forward during battle. Finally, there is the need to protect the head, and this was done with the galea, in this case a very basic helmet, made of bronze or copper. There were several models, but the most common was the Montefortino, which is the one shown on screen. The pivot seen above was used to add up to 3 vertical feathers to the helmet. In addition, there were 2 hinges on the sides that allowed to increase the head protection. If the Hastatis could afford it, he could buy 2 face protectors to protect the sides of the face, as we can see in the image that is currently on screen. And what was the function of the Hastatis? Well, they were the first line of hand-to-hand combat, so they were responsible for receiving the enemy charge and absorbing the impact. After this, they began to poke their enemies through the shields at the front. In an ideal world, the Hastatis would be enough to defeat the enemy, but this almost never happened because, remember, the Hastatis were the most inexperienced of the legion. When the Hastatis seemed to be tired or began to be overwhelmed by the enemy, the order was given and the Hastatis would retreat. Behind the princes, who then entered into combat, the Hastatis took the opportunity to rest and regain strength, as it was likely they would be thrown back into the front when the second line was tired. In this way, there were always fresh soldiers to throw into combat, unlike the enemy, who normally did not have this system of front replacement. Over time, the Hastati could gain experience and become part of the second line, the princes. I have referred to them as heavy infantry, and this is so because if we compare them with the velites, they are heavy, but within the infantry, hand-to-hand. That is, within the Hastati, princes and triarii, the Hastati were the lightest in equipment. And now you'll say, well, this video is supposed to talk about the Hastati and the princes, but only the Hastati have appeared. Yes, let me tell you. The equipment is the same, with some differences. The helmet in this case did usually have facial protections. Well, the princes could afford them. And the decorations they wore on top could consist of horsetails or feathers in the same colors as the Hastati. The princes used to wear not 1 but 2 greaves, 1 for each leg. And as for the armor, the vast majority wore chainmail, which protected the entire torso of the legionnaire, as well as a little below the waist, as seen on screen. Everything else is identical. Well, the princes were already veterans of the military world, unlike the Hastati, who were quite inexperienced, so they were able to resist the enemy in battle for a longer time. Having a superior quality, they positioned themselves in the second line, or the third if we count the velites, and they were in charge of relieving the Hastati when they were overwhelmed or simply exhausted from fighting. And that's it for today's video. I hope you liked it and learned something interesting. If so, you know what to do. Hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss any videos.